My doctoral mentor at Duke University was D. Moody Smith. And if I remember right, Moody said that he had been invited to be involved in the Jesus Seminar, but after he saw the direction it was going, he decided not to be involved. And yeah, him and apparently a lot of other people. But the Jesus Seminar was really popular at a certain time and actually was interviewed by all sorts of media outlets as the consensus of scholars. It was so effective in marketing its position that one day I was walking back from a church I was visiting, and there were two college students coming from the church, and we got into a conversation, and they asked me, "Can you tell us where to get one of those color-coded Bibles that tells us what Jesus really said?" So I know that they had a lot of effect. And I think they were partly trying to counter the religious right and the television evangelists whom they considered to be marketing that. But I think they were trying to market the opposite, and a lot of people on a popular level didn't really know how to evaluate either side, and they would just take what they would hear from either side and maybe combine them together. So I'm going to talk about the Jesus Seminar, but also some that were kind of in that orbit of thinking. Some were more radical than others. There were some members of the Jesus Seminar who actually were pretty mainstream, but the overall results of it were kind of disappointing to many of us who at least weren't a part of it. So some of these voices were very much not into the Jewish centered models of studying Jesus. That is, they weren't so much into what was the dominant center of the third quest for the historical Jesus. They were more like, to use somewhat less polite language, like a throwback to the second quest for the historical Jesus, using pretty much the same methods as in what was called the second quest. So the Jesus Seminar was a self-constituted group of scholars. They actually were really self-constituted when one group of scholars within them realized that they were a minority now and they would never get their votes favored when they took votes. So that group withdrew from the Jesus Seminar. Luke Timothy Johnson, who could say this because he taught at Candler, which is part of Vanderbilt University, pointed out that most major research institutions were unrepresented in terms of their faculty, and many of them in terms even of their graduates. Um, and they didn't include most of the major voices in the third quest. They didn't include John Meyer or Raymond Brown or Geza Vermish or E.P. Sanders or Gert Tyson or Annette Mertz or most of the major mainstream voices. They did have a couple. James Robinson pointed out that the way the Jesus Seminar would vote, everybody was supposed to read the papers beforehand, but one person would prepare the paper on each section that they were covering. And scholars being what we are and being busy with teaching responsibilities and so on, most people didn't actually, well, I don't know most, but many people didn't actually read all the papers in advance. So they would hear the paper presented and then they would vote on it. And they were known for voting with marbles, although they tended to do that only when the media were present because it was a way of getting attention and getting their message out. Uh, as to their votes with marbles, some of their critics thought that the Jesus Seminar had lost their marbles. But anyway, they didn't think that many, well, in their ultimate votes, they didn't think that many of the sayings were. There were actually only a small percentage of scholars, usually not more than 100 at any given time, who were present out of thousands of New Testament scholars around the world. But in any case, they were regularly consulted by media experts because they marketed themselves kind of as the voice of scholarship, even though a lot of scholars would have disagreed. So the Jesus Seminar, one of their big things was to do away with the eschatological Jesus, that is the idea of um, Jesus talking about future, especially end time ish or end of the age ish kind of cataclysmic events. Robert Funk, who was kind of the initiator, mentioned, or actually one of his colleagues mentioned his agenda to displace Albert Schweitzer's eschatological Jesus. Sometimes even a third of the seminar itself disagreed with the vote that ended up prevailing. But what we get are the conclusions of the seminar. Many complaints from other scholars. Some of them may have been too harsh, but I would be among those who would definitely demur from the Jesus Seminar's general outlook. So Luke Timothy Johnson, I mentioned, John Meyer, also E.P. Sanders. I don't know that he mentioned them by name, but he and a number of other scholars were very quick to criticize those who were promulgating a non-eschatological Jesus. Now, how non-eschatological they were, again, when the approach saying Jesus was kind of like a cynic prevailed, then in the votes, the people who thought Jesus was more apocalyptic were coming, and that further skewed the votes. This was Walter Wink, who was a member and actually didn't agree with everybody on everything there, clearly actually talked about God doing miracles. But the Jesus Seminar represent only one wing of scholarship. One member said, real critical scholars differ from evangelical scholars. Since I'm an evangelical scholar, I kind of take issue with that, but obviously evangelicals weren't the only ones taking issue with this. A wide range of other scholars, they got it from a lot of different sides. They even got it from the Jesus mythers, but the Jesus mythers field only like a couple scholars. I mean, anyway, that's another story. I won't even get into that. See Bart Ehrman for his critique of the Jesus mythers, or a lot of other people for their critiques of that. But in terms of the Jesus Seminar, they got it from both sides, although the vast majority of scholars were on the other side of the Jesus Seminar. So it was actually in a review session that included one of my books and also a book edited by Darrell Bach and Bob Webb. The Jesus Seminar respondent started his review by saying, there are two kinds of scholars. There are real critical scholars, and then there are evangelical scholars. And evangelical scholars shouldn't even be allowed in the room with us. How's that for a liberal, open-minded view of getting all the views on the table to discuss? No, our view wasn't even supposed to be there. And then I get to respond to him, and that's another story. So the Jesus Seminar produced a scholar's version of the Gospels, which by its title implies that a lot of other scholars weren't really scholars. They didn't say that, but then they, like Robert Funk, who was the director initially, the acceptance of only 16% of the gospel accounts as historically reliable will not surprise critical scholars, those without a theological bias, considering themselves the unbiased scholars, and the vast majority of scholars who accept more of the gospel accounts than they did as theologically biased. Not them, everybody else. Well, all of us have biases, right? But actually, they didn't accept the other versions like the NRSV edited by Bruce Metzger for the New Testament. No, the scholars' version was their version. Now, who is biased? In academia, some regard any argument supportive of historical interest in the Gospels as biased. Yet if believers, and you can regard things as historical in the Gospels even if you're not a believer, but anybody who's more conservative than they are in terms of how much we keep of the Gospels, if we have a bias towards that, and those of us who are believers have a bias towards faith, skeptics also have a bias towards skepticism. I started as an atheist and was converted to Christianity, so I have a Christian bias now. I had an atheist bias before. But anyway, moving on, apologetic biases. They speak of people who regard more as reliable than they do as being apologists. Now, an apologia in Greek means a defense, and scholars almost always defend their positions. If they, I mean, some issues we don't have positions, but on issues where we have positions, we almost always defend it, which means they have an apologetic bias, just like we have an apologetic bias. And maybe instead of making ad hominem arguments and calling people names, talking about each other's bias, we can look at the evidence, put the evidence on the table. So here's some complaints from some other scholars. Actually, I don't need to go through these because you can pause the slide if you want to go through these, but we can, I already mentioned them in summary, so I'm just moving on. Now, John Dominic Crossan thinks that arguing for a more cynic view of Jesus, not an eschatological or apocalyptic type of Jesus. And John Dominic Crossan is one of the better published scholars who has been involved with the Jesus Seminar. But Crossan counters that Jesus repudiated John's eschatology. So we know Jesus didn't believe in apocalyptic kind of things because John did. How do we know that Jesus was against John's view of the end? Well, in a saying of Jesus, he says that John was greater than any of the people who came before him. But those who will be in the kingdom will be greater than John. And so, in other words, he's saying he's dissing John. Now, I don't think calling Jesus calling John greater than all those who came before him are actually, I don't think that's actually dissing him. But he's speaking of a new era, the new era of the kingdom that John was preparing the way for. And he's not actually in context even talking about eschatology. He's just, I mean, he's talking about how those who are in the kingdom will be greater, but he's not talking about specifically what John taught about eschatology. In antiquity, and you see this in ancient rhetorical handbooks, you see it in the rabbis and so on, you don't just compare good things with bad things. You can compare good things with better things. And so if you want to make something look really good, you compare it with something that's already good, not just with something that's bad. So Jesus wasn't dissing John to make his own disciples, his own followers, look even better off than John. And some, and this is not, this is like an extreme view, but Burton Mack and some others treated Jewish elements in our accounts of Jesus as later additions. Now, it is true, clearly, I mean, going back to the time of the Maccabees, Greek culture, Greek language, a lot of things pervaded Lower Galilee and Jerusalem. But having said that, Jewish practice and thought, it didn't normally move the other direction. So you wouldn't find people in the broader Mediterranean world saying, let's turn a cynic kind of Jesus, a Greek philosopher kind of Jesus, into a rural Galilean Jewish Jesus. That would not have been a very smart move in terms of marketing Jesus among Gentiles. We have sometimes contextualization for a Greek context. So in Mark, when the paralyzed man is let down through the roof, Mark chapter 2, they tear up the roof between the beams. It fits what we know of Galilean roofs. And Luke contextualizes that when he retells it. You know, they're digging through. They're digging through the roof in Mark, but in Luke, it sounds like at least they're tearing up the roof tiles, which fits a northern Aegean kind of roof that fits more where Luke's audience probably lived. But where we have Galilean features or authentic Jerusalemite features about Jesus' ministry, or Judean features of John the Baptist's ministry, I mean, these are not things that would have been added by the later church. These were things that should go back to Jesus historically, at least in my opinion. And these come from the period where you have the earliest and most accurate memories of Jesus using what I think are normal historiographic methods. We know of no Gentile movement, Gentiles being non-Jews, we know of no Gentile movement in antiquity that adopted a conservative Jewish trajectory. And some of the things he finds as parallels, or people have proposed as parallels, that show, you know, this stuff goes back to the Greek world. So again, I love studying Greek culture. I actually was, you know, reading Plato when I was 13. I was reading Homer when I was 12 in English, admittedly. I was studying all that back when I was an atheist, before I became a Christian, before I ever started reading the Bible. But some of their parallels that try to make it look like this is from a Greek context and not a Jewish context don't make sense. So kisses, people greeted one another with kisses in mystery cults. Look, people greeted one another with kisses everywhere in the ancient Mediterranean world. That's how you would greet members of your family, you know, often with a light kiss on the lips, passionate if it was your spouse, but light kiss on the lips. You could do that for friends also, and various other settings. It was by no means limited to mystery cults. Same thing with baptisms. I mean, people had ceremonial washings before they would go into temples. They would have ceremonial washings, you know, when they would join the Qumran sect for the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that was just their initial washing. They'd have washings like regularly after that. Jewish culture practiced all sorts of ceremonial washings. And, you know, a Gentile who wanted to convert to Judaism, some people think this is later. I've argued it's earlier, but, you know, Gentiles were considered impure. So you had to have at least one washing coming in. But anyway, mysteries, we actually don't know that much about mystery cults from this period. We know about the myths, but we don't know that much about their initiations until a later period, when people started converting to Christianity who'd been initiated in the mysteries, and they said, oh, these are mysteries, we're not allowed to talk about them, but now that we're Christians, who cares? And then they started talking about them from a Christian perspective. And so a lot of our sources for the mysteries come from Tertullian and other Christian writers writing in a later period. But anyway, all that aside, saying that the baptisms are just in the mysteries, that's very limited. Saying any of this stuff is just in the mysteries. Seeing the Lord's Supper as a Hellenistic cult meal. Why would later diaspora Christians outside Judea and Galilee turn a Greek meal into a Passover Seder like what we have in the Gospels? And what seems to be implied, I mean, Paul already in 1 Corinthians 5, writing like 23 years after Jesus' public ministry, speaks of Jesus being sacrificed as our Passover, and so on. Why would the things go in that direction? And then Mack actually went so far as to say that it was the later Gentile Christians who thought of Jesus as the Messiah. Gentiles didn't have a Messiah category. I mean, Christos is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach. Mashiach meaning the anointed one. Well, Greeks anointed themselves for different things, but they didn't have the idea of the anointed one being a king or even a chief priest or something. So some of them apparently thought of Christ, Christos, as Jesus's last name. They didn't know what it meant unless or until it was explained to them, oh, Christ, the king, the Jewish king. It was an entirely Jewish category. The earliest extant witness about Jesus, most scholars think that either Galatians or First Thessalonians was Paul's earliest letter. I'm for First Thessalonians, but if it wasn't the first, it was the second. So in First Thessalonians, the Lord will descend from heaven with a shout. And it takes sayings that in the Gospels are attributed to Jesus and understands them very clearly in a future way. I mean, the earliest layer of what we know about Jesus, even being preached outside of Judea and Galilee, present him as an eschatological figure in terms of apocalyptic ways of thinking. As much as 2 decades before our first gospel, according to the usual critical dating. I actually date our first gospel earlier than some, but fairly within the range. People usually say 70, give or take 5 years. But anyway, or 6 years. Denying eschatological traditions in the Gospels requires us to dismiss a lot of the evidence that we do have, and then to make an argument from the silence that remains. So what Mac did, he said, okay, you've got this source common to both Luke and Matthew besides Mark. And actually, I agree that there's such a source. But then he took this source, and many of us agree with that, although not all scholars do, but then he took this source and divided it into 2 layers. One layer was the wisdom layer. The other layer was the eschatological prophet layer. And some other people had made that distinction, and but it's speculative because we know that there were Jewish documents from the period that actually had both, that the same person could author both. Paul, in his writings, actually speaks of both, like in Philippians. So we have no reason to say, okay, it couldn't be both. But then what he does, he says, okay, the wisdom layer is the earliest, and that's the one that's really authentic to Jesus. Well, basically what he's saying is, this is the Jesus I've reconstructed, and I use that to screen the evidence and say, this is the evidence that really counts. Most scholars didn't agree with him on that. John Dominic Crossan spoke of Jesus as a peasant Jewish cynic. To his credit, he didn't emphasize the cynic part as much, although he did have a big section on it in his background for going on it. But peasants made up probably 70% of free persons in the Roman Empire. Jesus did grow up in a rural village, so you could make sense of that. Much of his audience would have been Galilean subsistence farmers. But some of the peasant hypothesis was based on Marxist understanding of peasant societies and so on. I won't go into all that. But the question whether Jesus was a peasant himself, actually many leaders of peasant movements weren't peasants. They came from a different social class in history, including in the Roman world. But besides that, Jesus is called a builder. The Greek word tecton. I need to change my slide on this. I say probably a woodworker. Probably he was a multi-purpose builder, maybe more of a stonemason than a woodworker. Tecton in Greek, actually, one of my students who's doing his PhD at, I think, Oxford right now, he actually did a search of this word in that period of the Roman Empire and concluded that it often means a stonemason as well as a woodworker. So you can't really tell just from the wording. But Herod Antipas, the governor of Galilee, began rebuilding Sepphoris after it was destroyed in the year 6. So Jesus in his youth, the eldest son in a household headed by a builder, Joseph, I mean, lots of people from Nazareth were finding work, doing building work in Sepphoris, just 4 miles away. Actually, a lot of people in a lot of villages around Sepphoris were doing that. Now, artisans like carpenters, well, they were in the carpenters, other builders, they were in the lower artisan class, but they still were above the level economically, socioeconomically of peasants. And you look at the disciples he gathered too. I mean, some of them may have been peasants, but we have 5 of them whose professions are named. One of them is a tax collector, 4 of them are fishermen. None of them were agrarian peasants. So nothing against, farmers. Oh boy, we need farmers. God knows we need farmers. If the economy collapses, people around farms will be in the best shape. And my grandfather was a builder. I love builders. I probably would have been in the scribal class. He didn't call anybody from the scribal class, so far as we know. But anyway, so the idea that Jesus was a peasant is open to question, at least. The idea that Jesus was a cynic is even more questionable. Jesus as a Jewish cynic. What was a Jewish cynic? We know of Jewish sages. We know of Jewish signs workers, or those who attempted to do signs. We know of Jewish apocalyptic prophets. We don't know of any Jewish cynics. What's the comparative value of a category that has no other members in it? Cynics were also urban, which doesn't fit rural peasants, and also doesn't fit Jesus real well because even though he grew up near Sepphoris, Nazareth was a completely different culture. I mean, he'd be exposed to Sepphoris, but Nazareth was rural. It was way up the hill from Sepphoris, and archaeology shows us it was very conservative, Orthodox Jewish, and even Sepphoris was more Orthodox, conservative Jewish than some people thought before they distinguished between the Sepphoris of Jesus' day and what it looked like in subsequent centuries and so on. But anyway, so there was a cynic philosopher from Galilee, from a Gentile area in Galilee. He no longer lived in Galilee when he was teaching cynicism. So, I mean, everything we know about Jesus, and he didn't hang out. I mean, the Gospels don't talk about Sepphoris. They barely talk about Tiberias. Those were the 2 cities in Galilee. Magdala may have been sort of in that direction. Doesn't mention Jesus going there, but he probably did. He at least had one disciple from there, Mary Magdalene. Jesus does go to Jerusalem, as did other Galileans, but for the most part, just calling him a cynic just doesn't make much sense. And people have made comparisons to cynics because Jesus traveled a lot. Cynics were homeless. Well, most of Galilee was in walking distance. Maybe a day or 2 or 3 days at the most. You could, except during rainy season, you could be traveling around a lot. That didn't make you a cynic. Most poor people traveled on foot wherever they traveled. Many of them probably didn't travel widely, but they traveled some because they would sell their produce in other places. And also, in terms of traveling simply, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes apparently traveled simply. And you also have Old Testament prophets who would make the rounds, like Samuel or Elijah and Elisha. In fact, Josephus, the one figure to whom Josephus probably thinks of Jesus most when he speaks of this is in Josephus's Antiquities, book 18, paragraphs 63 and 64, where he speaks of Jesus. He speaks of Jesus as a wise sage, but he also speaks of Jesus as a worker of wonders, which is language he uses for the prophet Elisha elsewhere. And so, I mean, he also uses the term in other ways, but in terms of a leader, uh, somebody who was a speaker, who was followed by people, Jesus and Elisha in particular. So, uh, people who say Jesus was like a cynic, they say, well, cynics told aphorisms. Aphorisms are short, crisp, concise statements of wisdom. Well, what is the book of Proverbs? And also some of Jesus' parables are, like Proverbs. They fit sometimes Old Testament prophets, Old Testament sages, other Jewish sages. You don't have to be a cynic to speak like that. I mean, Ben Franklin wasn't a cynic, and he said haste makes waste. I used to live in Philadelphia, where Ben Franklin had lived, and I can assure you from drivers in Philadelphia that they didn't all agree with him. Anyway, real cynics lived on the street. They excreted and stimulated themselves sexually in public. Sometimes they accosted passersby with insults. Um, well, Jesus does denounce certain cities, but he does it in a very Jewish prophet-like way, including his wording in those ways. Bold, bold speech characterized cynics. They like to insult people, but a closer model is the Old Testament prophets. Jesus, when he's talking about the kingdom, he's not merely critiquing the social order, he's announcing a new era that God is bringing about. Those who made a comparison between Jesus and the Cynics said, well, the Cynics said that the philosopher is fit to reign like a king. So did Stoics, so did disciples of Plato. I mean, that was just common Greek philosophy. It wasn't limited to the Cynics, but if you want to say, well, Cynics do this, that's true. Cynics did say that. But what does the reign or the potential reign, because they never actually got the reign normally, the Stoic philosopher did, but Cynics saying the potential reign of a philosopher, is that closer to Jesus' preaching of the kingdom of God than the Jewish teaching of the kingdom of God? Well, Mack said no, the kingdom of God. Mack was, I mean, I'm giving you an extreme, so not everybody did this. And yeah, Mack was right. Cynic philosophers did say that. But it wasn't limited to cynics. And again, Mack was saying, cynics said this, but Jewish people didn't really say this. But that's not true. Jewish people did talk about the kingdom of God. I mean, it wasn't pervasive in every stream of Jewish material, but you do have it mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it was common in Jewish prayers. The Jewish prayer, the Kaddish, certainly wasn't borrowed from Jesus, who said, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. But the Kaddish also says, exalted and hallowed be your great and glorious name. May your kingdom come speedily and soon in our days, in the days of our children, and so on. And if you don't want to accept any of that, how about the Old Testament? God's reign, God's kingdom is spoken of in the Psalms. And it's spoken of in Daniel chapter 2, where it actually has the phrase, the mystery of the kingdom, just like Jesus does in his parables that most scholars consider authentic. Mack even thought that there was this conspiracy where the second century church suppressed the uh, I mentioned earlier the material shared by Matthew and Luke, and that most scholars think that most of this material that's shared that's not in Mark was a collection of Jesus' sayings. I think it goes a little bit more than that. Some narrative about John the Baptist and some narrative about the centurion's servant. But be that as it may, mostly collection of sayings, collection of Jesus' teachings. Max says no. Second century church suppressed that genre. So actually, that was the earliest. That comes before the Gospels. Well, I do think that that material was earlier than Mark and Matthew and Luke and John. Personally, I do think it's earlier. But the idea that the church later suppressed that genre, I mean, they still had Proverbs. And not only that, but the collections of sayings seem to have increased by the end of the first century or possibly early second century. In the Didache, you have teachings of Jesus in the two ways material. You also have it in the Epistle of Barnabas, which I don't believe was written by Barnabas, but be that as it may, it actually increased, it wasn't suppressed. And wisdom and apocalyptic eschatology are not incompatible. We have Jewish documents from before the ministry of Jesus and in the first century that include both. So now this slide is outer darkness with wailing and gnashing of teeth, which is kind of apocalyptic. But all that to say, there are reasons why many of us think that the Jesus Seminar and other groups that focused more on a Hellenistic Jesus were more like the second quest than the third quest, which especially put Jesus in his own Galilean Jewish framework. And I think maybe it isn't nice that some people have said the Jesus Seminar lost its marbles, but there are probably better places to look for mainstream Jesus scholarship. As I mentioned in another video, places like E.P. Sanders, Air Tyson, Annette Mertz, John Meyer, and a number of Dale Allison, and just the list could go on.